Thanks, Brian. I appreciate the wonderful introduction, not to mention you keeping us on track over the past 2 days. So, all right, day 2 opener before the coffee really gets going. This should be interesting. So, before my most recent career as a customer success and post-sale leader building and scaling really amazing teams and companies from startups to the Fortune 250, I was a mail carrier, a mechanic, a motorcycle instructor, a tour guide, bartender, graphic designer, and a daycare provider. So I guess one way or another, I've been in customer success my entire career. I'm also a husband, motorcyclist, amateur racer, woodworker, cat dad, and general renaissance man, or a polymath for Mark. I don't know if he's here. Most of you likely don't care about any of that stuff, except for the CS part, so we'll stick to that topic for the next couple of minutes. So when Alex asked me to speak about alignment with sales teams, I had to put some real thought into it. We all like to joke about sales, and there's understandable tension between CS and commercial teams. That's just how it is. But as I mentioned, I also worked in a daycare with 23 and 4-year-old toddlers, and there's some similarities there, so we'll just go with that. Kidding aside, for much of my leadership career, I have either been an extremely close peer or in some cases even reported to sales leaders, and want to share some of what I've learned to help make your lives easier in working with probably one of our most important relationships outside of customers. Now, especially with a likely recession coming, right? We know that CFOs and CIOs are looking at cost reduction. We need to be a proactive partner to maintain those relationships and support our sales partners. So I'm going to start today with a short story. As I mentioned, racing is something I'm really passionate about, but to be honest, I know like zilch about NASCAR, so don't worry if you don't either. I know go fast, turn left, that's about it. One thing many of you might know about racing, though, is that the driver is usually the one who gets credit for the big wins. Any parallels to what we do? But behind every driver, or not even behind every driver, every professional win is the result of a team working seamlessly together on a common goal. Anyway, I heard an amazing story about NASCAR a few years ago that reminded me a lot of the challenges between customer success and collaborating with our sales peers. So flashback to 1990 when this picture was taken, the heady days of snap bracelets, troll dolls, windbreakers, jelly sandals, and dial-up modems, which, anyway. Like many of you, I was probably watching cartoons or riding my bike around the neighborhood, looking around the room. There may even be some of us who refer to those days as the 1900s, as my nephew calls them, which is guts me. Anyway, while we were engrossed in Hanna-Barbera, a young guy named Andy Papathanasu was watching NASCAR at Sonoma Raceway in Northern California. He'd been an offensive guard on the football team at Stanford. But he loved racing, and this guy had a dream of making it a career, somehow. So after watching his first pit stop at the race, he did what any normal, thoughtful person would do, jumped the fence, snuck into the garage, and volunteered to join a professional racing team. And it worked, somehow. So within a few years, he joined Hendrick Motorsports as the pit crew coordinator for the number 24 DuPont team. Now, a pit crew coordinator was something that didn't exist in NASCAR until Andy came along. But in '95, just 3 years later, the newest driver on the Hendricks team, a guy named Jeff Gordon, became the youngest to ever win a NASCAR title, in no small part because his crew consistently had the fastest pit stops in the field. So what was different about him? Well, in those days, a 6-person NASCAR pit crew could change 4 80-pound tires and put 12 gallons of fuel into a car in about 30 seconds. But Andy's team at Hendricks was doing their full pit stops a full 10 seconds faster, about 20 seconds. Now, racing is a sport where milliseconds matter, so that kind of advantage is an eternity. 10 seconds saved in the pits will put you half a mile further down the racetrack when you rejoin. So how the heck did he do this, and yeehaw, what does this have to do with customer success? Well, like any group effort, be it sports, theater, or democracy, the best field organizations exemplify 3 must-have behaviors. First, we need to be curious. We also need to build absolute and strong trust with our peers, especially sales. And it's critical to create mutual respect and accountability across our teams. Now, of course, these apply to all relationships. Right? We'll focus on how it applies between sales and CS, but these are just as critical for relationships with customers and other teams, and frankly, my marriage as well. So what does that NASCAR story have to do with curiosity? Well, historically, NASCAR had always hired mechanics to do pit stops and then trained them to work pretty quickly. But when young Andy saw that team doing their first pit stop, it reminded him of nothing quite as much as a football team executing a complex play. And he said, I wanted to view pit stops more as an athletic event that required a little bit of mechanical knowledge, rather than the conventional wisdom at the time which was that they were a purely mechanical event. So at Hendrix, he tried a completely new approach focused on practice and repetition, coaching and review, and optimization and process improvement. Most importantly, he sought collegiate athletes with an optimization mindset who could build muscle memory and had practice doing that to do the same motions extremely quickly without thinking about them. So I loved when Ashley mentioned yesterday that her superpower was, where's Ashley? That she mentioned yesterday that her superpower was being endlessly curious. How can that help us to approach problems differently? So if we're being fair, in our zeal to help customers, we have a tendency to cultivate a problem-solving mindset, right? And we tend to respond to the first question that's asked. But the actual root cause is almost never the first thing that somebody asks for help with. The best CS professionals constantly cultivate a deep curiosity in their entire approach to work, not just for customer problems, but for working with their internal teams. So how do we do this? First, apply a beginner's mind. Be open and look for new and novel ways of doing things. I love that Mark called out hiring from other teams and other roles yesterday. Some of the best CSMs I've ever hired were sales folks, teachers, support folks, or other people who'd never done the job before. And they approached the job unburdened by conventional wisdom, or that's the way we've always done it. Next, you gotta ask questions, listen, and observe. Seek first to understand, what are your peers' goals? And both professionally and their personal ones. Do you have common interests or goals outside of work? And how do their professional goals overlap with you or your team's priorities? For example, Scott mentioned yesterday being a work therapist and having to understand how the internal politics and relationships can really affect everything that you're doing. Third, try something new. Read a book in a genre you usually avoid. Listen into a sales discovery call, or ask sales peers to join your calls with customers. Vary your commute. We're all working from home, so go through the kitchen instead of through the living room to your home office. Kidding aside, you need to open your mind to new points of view. And finally, be inquisitive. Ask your peers, especially in different functional areas, their opinions, perspectives, and their approaches to certain things. Everyone does things a bit differently, and there are potentially new answers and new solutions to problems hidden in other people's thinking that we may never have come up with ourselves. Personally, I've learned a ton from sales peers around objection handling. It's something that they often have great tips to deal with. They do it all the time, and they can really help get customers unstuck from a problem when a customer has just really dug their feet in on something and won't talk about anything else. And combining these together will help to build a framework of how you approach new challenges. Another way to cultivate a curious mindset is to use investigative frameworks and incorporate them into your own day-to-day. One example I love is the 5 whys. It was a method developed by Sakichi Toyoda here on the left. It was a Japanese inventor who founded a small automotive manufacturer many of us have probably heard of. This technique became an integral part of the lean philosophy and the Toyota production system created by Taiichi Ohno there on the right. So what are the 5 whys? How does it work? One of the key factors for successful implementation of the technique is really to make an informed decision. This means that the decision-making process should be based on an insightful understanding of what's really going on, and you have to deeply understand the current situation. Taiichi-san stated, the basis of Toyota's scientific approach is to ask why 5 times whenever they confront a problem. By repeating why 5 times, the nature of the problem as well as its solution becomes clear. So as an example, in my most recent role at Adobe, one of my CSMs had an extremely frustrated customer who was really peeved that some pretty basic collaboration features were missing from one of our most popular desktop publishing and photography tools. And he knew, even if he got it on the roadmap today, it wasn't going to be around for a year, right? And that wasn't going to work for the customer. So he asked why. Why is this such a pain? Well, the footwear designer needed to get buy-in from brand marketing and a bunch of other teams before they could approve a new shoe design for wearing. Why? Well, previous designs had made it to production before issues were discovered, and it cost a ton of money to fix that. Why is that painful? Well, prototyping and shipping mock-ups takes a long time. They're designed in Oregon, manufactured in China, shipped back for initial review, and then more are made for brand marketing, right? Sorry, I kind of combined my third and fourth why there. And when he asked why they have to do all this, he uncovered that the entire product development process was slow, it was analog, it was inefficient. And by digging into a single question from a single shoe designer, he uncovered a massive gap at the company. Now in the short term, he got that designer access to our 3D tools, which were cloud native and had those collaboration tools built in. So they were able to run a pilot really quickly, which turned into a $5 million deal to revamp their entire new product development cycle for all footwear. It reduced time to market significantly because they had mock-ups of their shoes now ready to go. They could get feedback in near real time, and it also facilitated a direct B2C motion, which they couldn't do before because they didn't have time to create the assets. It was a huge win for the customer. There's an important caveat here though. You can't just answer a question with another question sometimes. In addition to curiosity, we need to display really deep empathy for our customers' problems and for sales. For example, a salesperson comes up to me and says, I need to know what's going on with this renewal, but we're 1 year into a 3-year deal. You know, if I just ask, dude, why does this matter? My response is going to put them off. It clearly shows that their priority isn't mine, and I don't care. But instead, I can say, I hear you. Honestly, we're so focused on onboarding and adoption, I hadn't even considered that yet. If you tell me what's going on, I can dig a little bit and maybe get some help for you. There's a huge difference there. So key points for curiosity. Probe and understand. Ask lots of questions to better understand the underlying problem. Put simply, challenge yourself to not respond to a question, especially if you know the answer. Dig a little bit. And most importantly, be genuinely empathetic to others' needs and issues. I thought Harini's point yesterday about becoming the best friend of sales was a fantastic point. All right, so I also said you must build trust with your peer teams. Now, as a snot-nosed college grad with zero experience, racing or otherwise, Andy would have been laughed out of every single NASCAR HQ if he'd waltzed in and said, I know how to do pit stops better than the professionals. Instead, he joined a team, he did the job for a couple of years, building experience and really understanding the challenges before he suggested any improvements. He built trust with his teammates and leaders that he was knowledgeable about their job. He wasn't just a Stanford guy with a degree in organizational behavior, which he also had. So how do we build trust within our peer relationships? So when people talk about CS and sales, all kinds of buzzwords come to mind, right? We've got a whole bunch of them here on the screen. I'm not going to preach to this choir. But there are a few key points to any business partnership worth mentioning. One, set expectations early. Reestablish them often. Communicate regularly to ensure you're aligned with people. Work together with peers to create a long-term plan for partnership and include your customer in it so you all know where you're going together. And emphasize that success and share it widely with your customers and with your sales teams and support it with data, especially data that's important to your audience. So for sales, make sure that they know what's going on with usage and adoption because they're the ones who are going to turn that around into an expansion deal. And for leaders, share everywhere across the entire company to reinforce the impact that your team is having on the bottom line. Going deeper, we need to really work to build intra-team trust early in the cycle and ensure all team members are aligned across all services to drive that flywheel effect. So when a deal closes, or ideally beforehand, make sure the handoff happens. Push sales to share info on the customer's challenges and needs, who the key stakeholders are, and what criteria they're going to be using to judge the success of their investment. I'm sure I'm sure nobody in this room has ever had the experience of having a deal thrown over the fence. You have no idea why it was signed, who the people are, and it leads you to having to cold sell into the customer and try to drive adoption when nobody even knows why this new tool was purchased or who's supposed to be using it. There's huge amounts of pushback, and this is a great way to cut that off, not to mention make your engagement with customers even better because you start knowing what's going on. Secondly, unless it's ice cream or sex, but we're not going to go there, nobody likes surprises, right? Share potential trouble early and demonstrate that you're already working to avoid revenue impacts so people don't have to worry about it. And closing the loop, as we drive onboarding and adoption, capture that usage data. Understand new use cases and new needs, and most critically, any evidence that you can capture value realization or ROI. And you may have to lead the customer to it. Saving time, you can quantify that. You got a number of people on a team, a number of hours in a week, you can multiply that by whatever number you want and come up with cost savings pretty quickly and clearly for the customer. As leaders advocating for the value of our teams, it's especially critical for any direct contributions to revenue, right? And by sharing that information ahead of time, it makes the renewal and ideally expansion that much easier for sales. And this is more than just NRR, right? I'm talking about leads from CS, customer referrals, close rate for opportunities that are sourced by CSMs, and more. And I might sound a bit like a broken record here, but keys to any trusted relationship are understanding and empathy. We already talked a bit about understanding, but why is empathy more than just a buzzword? It's human, yeah. Displaying empathy for your peers' challenges and ensuring any proposed solutions support their goals as well helps to form a human connection, right? Showing that you sympathize with your peers, as simple as it may sound, and demonstrating your commitment to helping them meet their goals reinforces the trust that you're working so hard to build. You can say, I'll do it as much as you want, but until they see that you're actually taking their priorities and goals on board, you don't have that connection. All right, the cornerstones of building trust. Seek to understand what your peers are asked to achieve and how they're measured. Share the same for yourself. Trust is earned. It requires talking and listening and must be constantly nurtured. These seem self-evident, but it's so often that I don't see this happening in CS and in sales. All right, finally, creating mutual trust and accountability. Andy and other NASCAR pit crews study video, not just after the competition like other sports, but during a race to analyze each stop and see how they can improve for the next one. This isn't just about getting more efficient though. Going over the wall is dangerous. The pit lane speed limit at Daytona Speedway is 55 miles an hour. Now, that seems glacial compared to race speeds of over 200 or whatever it is. But as anybody who's ever broken down on the side of the highway as traffic whizzes by can attest, 55 ain't slow, right? You need to have teams need to have millimeter precision to get the pit stop right and avoid injury. Every person has a specific job, specific timing, and specific place to be, and they're reliant on others doing their jobs as well for the job to be completed safely, smoothly, and most importantly, quickly. It requires constant practice, review, and absolute faith that your teammates are going to be there for you as you must be there for them. So how can we build this into our own relationships with sales and other peer teams? So I get it. A lot of you are probably thinking, this dude worked at Adobe. They can send an army to solve any problem. And while there are more than 25,000 people there, most of our account teams are very small, even for the largest enterprise customers. It's one CSM, one AE, and one solutions consultant, and every one of them have other customers as well. Theoretically, all teams at any company are working towards the same overall goal, but we know making the employer successful has a lot of different ramifications when we get down to team levels. And those can sometimes conflict when team level goals are set. For example, it's commonly accepted that customers buy more than new ones. We all know that, right? So sales often looks to our teams and other customer-facing teams for help, and I'm sure none of us have ever been asked to source leads for sales. Now, CSM certainly a deep insight into what our customers need, but that kind of effort can really undermine our primary mission of helping the customers be successful with their investment. It doesn't help us or another team to just adopt their goals as our own. Instead, it's better to closely track metrics that are just as supportive for sales, but aligned with our priorities too. Customer references, new executive relationships in BUs that are untouched by our business, publish customer stories of value realization, blogs, and other marketing opportunities that are just as critical to the sales cycle, but are aligned with what we need to do too. And addressing these conflicts requires constant alignment, collaboration, and mutual respect from individuals, from executives to ICs and everywhere in between. Everybody in the organization is responsible for it. So putting this into practice, I always tell my CSMs, be a conductor of the orchestra, never be the loudest instrument. It requires the trust we've been building and extremely careful coordination. So how do we do it? First, be clear about your engagement model. Seek input from other functional areas when you're defining it or building it, and regularly reinforce it to peers, whether you're a sole contributor or a leader running an entire team. Second, share your priorities and KPIs. quarterly at least, or anytime there are major changes that happen. Personally, I include sales leaders in my strat planning every year to ensure our priorities and KPIs are complementary, if not the same. Also, I ask them to share our finalized goals in their sales team, or I share them in sales teams meetings with every rep, so they all know what we're measured on. And I ask sales to do the same for my teams so that they know how their peers are being measured and what they're responsible for. So let's say an individual CSM, if you know sales is grinding to find traction for a new product, do some discovery with customers to find an opportunity. You're going to solve a need for a customer before they even thought to ask you about it, and by bringing those to sales, they understand that you're in it for their goals as well. Oh, sorry, I may have just beamed somebody here. Edward, I apologize if I just blinded you in the back there. So third, roles and responsibilities. It drives me nuts when somebody sidelines my team or tries to do their job. We wear a lot of hats as CSMs, but it should be, we got to be extremely careful about inadvertently treading on somebody else's toes. Even if it's accidental, it undermines that trust and respect, and they can't do our job. And frankly, even though we might think we could, we're not as good at theirs as they are. Do ensure others are fulfilling their roles and responsibilities, though, and not leaving you hanging. Part of this is being crystal clear about what swim lanes are and handing that off seamlessly. Nobody looks good when a team is fighting over the ball. And you want to make sure that you're aligned long before you're in front of the customer. Be in harmony, not competing with each other. Find ways to collaborate outside of customer efforts. Invite your peers to QBRs, both with customers and internally. Collaborate on process improvements or other efforts, like planning a cross-team event. I think we all know innately that leadership exists at all levels. It's not just a management thing. And frankly, non-managers often have more influence because they don't have that management responsibility. Look to the leaders on your team to help drive some of this collaboration and bring teams together. One of the best ways I found to reinforce that collaboration across teams is by having trusted partners share our stories instead of trying to tell them ourselves. People trust those who are closest to them, the teammates, the people who are doing their jobs, more than they trust peers. For example, we asked a sales rep to present a deal deconstruction recently to their entire team for a major media company that likes to do things and chill. They'd been pushing hard on a quick win for the customer. The customer was ready to buy. There was a small opportunity there, but the CSM was already pushing a long game, working with the heads of all of the different studios across this organization, who all had independent buying power and used different tools. It took some convincing and some help, but the CSM pulled the AE back, and the end result was getting all of the studio heads aligned and having a 500% increase. And this is a customer who's already spending multiple millions of dollars a year with us. So this is not small change. They went from $2 to $10 million a year. Now the CSM could have easily told that story, and frankly, maybe could have told it better. But having the AE share how the CSM's efforts set them up for success landed much better, not to mention coming up with a much, much bigger deal than they would have gotten. It made this rep's quota for the year. In other words, if sales is coin operated, appeal to their interests, right? Go back to the money and tell them a story in a way that's meaningful for them. Fifth, regularly drive accountability. We always say under promise and over deliver. It's not just a cliche. If your peers can always depend on you, holding them accountable becomes even easier. Be collaborative, give and take, but never be a doormat. Reinforce your role and value with the team and with sales, and show them that your seat at the table is critical to the customer relationship. It's not accidental. We're not earning a seat at the table. I like that Edward said yesterday that we're defining, or that we're leading the table. We are going to be the ones bringing them out of these trouble areas. And lastly, just like with comments about trust, we need to always seek to build human connections. Socialize together, get to know each other outside of what you're doing day to day. And that can be tough in a working from home world. But it's even more important when folks don't have that time outside of meetings or after work to socialize together. And this sounds really corny, but we have a couple of folks on our team who are huge trivia dorks. And they pulled together folks across a bunch of teams for regular like quiz show happy hours. And it sounds hokey, and virtually it's tough. But folks still have a lot of time, or a lot of fun, and that supports the relationships that were built before we were remote, and the ones that don't get enough nurturing when we're just jumping onto a Zoom call for 30 minutes and then jumping off and going to change the laundry. It's a lot harder to disrespect a friend than that CSM over there. All right, takeaways for this last section. Align on your engagement and priorities and goals. Make sure they understand yours. Reinforce your roles and responsibilities and ensuring you deliver seamlessly for the customer and that other teams keep up their end of the bargain as well. Work together outside the day-to-day to build those relationships. Keep each other accountable and deliver on your commitments too. And build true relationships, not just acquaintances. To wrap up, be curious, be genuinely empathetic. Remember the 5 whys. Build trust by listening to your peers and showing empathy for their needs and goals. And create accountability. Ensure you and your peers understand each other's priorities and KPIs. Work to help them meet their goals, and I guarantee they will work to help you on yours. These all apply to any relationship, as I said at the beginning, certainly with customers, but absolutely with sales counterparts. All right, one last thing before I wrap up. Let's check back in with our buddy Andy. Through iteration, continuing to be curious, building trust across teams, and keeping each other accountable, not to mention a lot of practice, those same NASCAR crews are performing pit stops in under 12 seconds. Now, 30 years later, his impact on NASCAR continues to be felt in every race, which is the only reason I can pronounce this last name. All right, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Seriously, thanks for being such a thoughtful and responsive audience. I'm really honored to be sharing with you folks.
Thank you, Colby.
You bet.
I'll never think about ice cream the same way ever again. I'm just kidding.
I didn't say to combine them. I just
that's
said those are the only surprises people like. You do you, Brian.
All right, so we have some time for some questions. So if CX CFO is hands-off post-sale, should CS still run tandem communication with CFO, or should sales own that relationship?
I can't remember who said it yesterday, but I do think that you don't want to have multiple people competing to own a single relationship, right? If your salesperson has a really strong relationship with the CFO, they can bring you into meetings and should bring you into meetings, but you shouldn't try to usurp that relationship. Use your time instead to build executive relationships with folks that they don't have and build multiple champions across the org.
Awesome. Awesome. And then how do you encourage other teams to care about your team's KPIs if they are not in alignment?
Like I said, during strat planning, I try and understand how or what other teams are being measured on, and I try and find that link. Even if they don't seem complementary, I try and find a through line that I can share with my team, and that, more importantly, that I can share with other teams so they understand that helping us meet our goals will help them meet theirs.
Awesome. And then should a CSM bring in an AE in every expansion deal?
I mean, how many accounts should a CSM carry? Right? I think that varies a lot depending on what the organization is. Some organizations have CS maintain renewals. Some have them bring in an inside sales rep. I tend to think that anytime there's expansion revenue on the table, yeah, you want to bring in an AE, right? Because it's always going to help their quota. And frankly, part of the art of CS is delegating, right? You may be able to close that, but why not have the salesperson do it, right? Yeah. That's how I'd approach it.
And then quick question for me. So how do you ensure the adoption of swim lanes? So in my opinion, I built out this beautiful RACI chart for how CS and sales should be working together, but it's always kind of touch and go in terms of what that adoption looks like. How do you ensure adoption for situations like that?
That's a tough lesson. I mean, I think the first time I ever came up with a RACI like that, I went around and did a whole road show and showed everybody, but I was hammering a square peg into a round hole, right? I hadn't really talked about it with folks when I was building the roles and responsibilities, and so it looked like something that I was just dropping on them and I expected them to deal with. Yep. So now when I'm developing an engagement model, setting goals, setting priorities, I do it and I run the drafts by my sales peers, my solutions consulting peers, so that I can understand what they're measuring their teams on. And just like I need to come up with a through line that I can explain to my teams, I want to make sure that they understand and they're bought in on what we're going to be doing as well. One of the last things I did before I left the digital marketing role at Adobe, which was a couple of jobs ago, was redefine the entire customer lifecycle and what individual teams were doing at that part. And it wasn't something we just did in a vacuum and then turned around and said, it's done. It was something that we had to work with sales and solutions consulting and marketing and all these other teams, professional services, onboarding, yada, 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 to make sure that we weren't saying, you guys are going to do this, right? That they hadn't planned to do, and we weren't taking things on ourselves that they thought strongly belonged to them.
Awesome, appreciate that. And last question, so how do you gain CS-driven led attribution without sales feeling like CS is encroaching on their profession or feeling threatened by CS?
By handing off early, right? Once you find the lead and you've done just the littlest bit of discovery, give it to your salesperson. There's not a salesperson in the world that would rather have a cold lead from a BDR who's dialing for dollars than a CSM who knows exactly what the customer needs and says, listen, I think these folks are ready to buy, right? So they appreciate that, and I think just like I mentioned earlier, get it off your plate, right? Once you've found it, it's not your responsibility anymore. You still need to be in touch with it. You still need to know what's going on. But if you give it over to sales, then they've got an opportunity to run with. They've got something to report for quota retirement that they're working on in their weekly forecast calls. And you've got something right there that you can hand off to them. I think the other thing that is really important is tracking that, right? Making sure in Salesforce or whatever your CRM is that you're tracking the lead source and that CSM is a specific value there. Whether you have CSMs created in Salesforce or just tell your rep and then make sure that you've got a report showing which opportunities your team has created or sourced, then you can go back and say, listen, the close rate on these leads is way higher than what you're getting from BDRs. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying we should replace the BDR team because heaven forbid, but we can say, listen, when we give you guys a lead, it means something. Right? These are going to close faster, they're going to close easier, and they're going to close for more money than the cold leads that we bring in.
Awesome. One more time for Colby Teller.
Thanks, everybody.